Hey guys, welcome back. Have you ever felt that the frog deck is very polarizing? Either you do extremely well or you do extremely poorly. Why is this? Did you get deck devastation virus for your whole hand? Did they rug your singular monarch and you weren't able to deal with their established field and you lost the next turn? I believe the main issue with the frog deck is people want to go above and beyond. They want to do the entire world with the frog deck just because you can. With the frog deck in Edison format, the world is your oyster. Seeing a substitute allows you to do pretty much whatever you want in the entire game. You can get Unifrog to pop their back rows, you can get Flip-Flop Frog to out their monsters, you can get Death Frog to run over their monsters, or you can just sit behind Dupe with the sublock and incrementally getting advantage every single turn. This is where the difference in the American versus the European mindset comes into play. American players tend to favor combo decks and build their decks with a high ceiling, known as the bigger deck, while Europeans tend to play decks which are focused on the long game. And this is where the issue lies. People want to do above and beyond with their frog deck, and they end up losing to cards like Royal Oppression, DD Crow, and just your opponent's engine coming at you at full force because they don't have enough defensive cards. Dreamfrog was a step in the right direction, but I believe people took it too far. Now they lose to decks like Gladiator Beast because they don't have enough defensive cards in their deck. I believe I found a solution to make the frog deck faster than the typical stun Monarch deck, while still incorporating a mid-range game plan so it's not all the way to the Dreamfrog route. And of course, it's not Hero Frogs. I don't want to play a bunch of bricks in my deck, and Miracle Fusion is quite a flawed bomb. As this is the most intricate deck in Edison format, I decided to gather a bunch of different replays against meta and rogue decks. I urge you to check those out in the description to learn more about the frog deck and see top level frog gameplay. And without further ado, let's jump right into the deck profile.
To start the profile off, I play 3 copies of Substitute, 3 copies of Swap Frog, 3 copies of Dupe Frog. I play 3 Dupe, partially because I'm using the frog cards as a grind engine, so I want to make sure to have the 3rd copy in my deck to summon off the sub. But this is also not a bad draw in the current meta. Being able to set this card against Blackwing or Vayu turn 1 can buy you a few turns to see your Substitute. Then I'm playing 2 copies of Treeborn Frog. Playing 2 copies of Treeborn is very necessary. If you have a Dupe lock and a Swap Frog on the field, and you bring back a Treeborn, you want to use Swap to bounce the Treeborn, pair it with a discard trap, and on the next turn, when you bring back the Treeborn, you can sack it for a Caius, and then bounce the Caius back with Swap Frog. And for the utility frogs, I play 1 copy of Unifrog to hit back row and to out Black Whirlwind, and 1 copy of Flip-Flop Frog. So some people don't play him because they think it's win more, but the thing is, when you're not playing Dream Frogs, and you're playing Control Frogs, you need a way to accumulate advantage over a few turns as well as being able to handle their field. Say you have a Dupe lock on the field. At this point, your opponent has 2 options. Either they can commit a monster so you can't Swap Frog attack directly a few turns and whittle them down that way, but then they play into Flip-Flop Frog. When you play against the Frog Mirror or Amaryllis, it's very important to use Flip-Flop Frog to bounce away all their tokens, their Titanials, their Amaryllis, and in the Frog Mirror you can take away all the frogs. This guy does not target because he checks on resolution similar to Stratos, so they can't Titanial negate this. So this guy is not in my main deck. I had Death Frog in the main for the longest time, but the issue I ran into was that I needed more defensive cards, and this was the most cuttable card I had. Now this card is very good against decks like Hero Beast, against decks like Blackwing, where if you do your sub combo, you just want to summon a 1900 attack beatstick to kill their monster, and then you can tribute this off and still end on a sublock for your next turn, but you dealt with their monster, so now you can't get Caius. We'll touch more on Death Frog once we get to the side deck. For the Monarch part of the deck, I play 3 copies of Caius the Shadow Monarch. Caius is not the best Monarch when you loop him back with Swapped Frog, but he's the best one into an established field. Then I have 2 copies of Risa, the Storm Monarch. Risa is the best Monarch into a board if you're doing your Swap Frog bounces, considering you can make sure that they draw a dead card for their next turn. And if my opponent doesn't commit because they want to play around Caius or Risa, I play 2 copies of Testalos and 1 Junk Synchron, forcing them to eventually commit to the field, and then I can use Caius or Risa. Junk Synchron is similar to a Monarch in the sense that it's a payoff when you have Treeborn Frog, or any frogs in the graveyard really. The best play you can do with this is to bring back the Swap Frog, bounce back the Junk, protect Swap Frog with a trap card, next turn, summon the Junk, summon a sub, and then Swap Frog, bounce back the sub. I'm only playing one Junk Synchron in the main deck, and that is because games 2 and game 3, if I had multiple copies, I would want to side those out, seeing as usually when you see one Junk Synchron, you can recur it back if you need to. It's also another card that gets hits by Deck Devastation Virus and Royal Oppression, while these Monarch cards are immune. I'm playing one Gorse, as well as 2 copies of Battle Fader. So I didn't have Fader in my deck for the longest time, because it loses to Oppression and Deck Devi. However, I noticed against some of the faster decks, I lost out because I didn't have enough defensive cards in my hand. This deck cannot main deck as many trap cards as Blackwing or Vayu can, so you want to play some other defensive cards that works well with your engine. Battle Fader can also let you summon a Monarch if you're stuck with a bunch of these in your hand with no access to Treeborn Frog. Although I do side these out against decks that bring in Royal Oppression or Deck Devastation Virus for other defensive cards. Battle Fader is also a 1-for-1 target, so when I have 1-for-1 and already have Substitute access, or have already gone through Substitute, there's still a target in my deck. Since I'm not playing Deathfrog in the main deck, I'm not playing Fishborg Blaster, and since I'm not playing Fishborg, I wanted to have another 1-for-1 target in my deck. It's nice to have the option with 1-for-1 to summon Fader and bounce it back with Swap Frog, although I still keep in 1-for-1 even when I take these out, because 1-for-1 is just the best starter in the deck. For the spell cards, I'm playing 3 copies of Salvage. This card is much better than Avarice, seeing as it plays around Deck Devastation Virus by getting your frogs back to your hand. If they use Deck Devastation Virus in the draw phase against you, and they hit cards like Substitute or Swap Frog, as long as you have 2 of these kind of cards in the graveyard, you can salvage them back and still get access to Treeborn Frog, while an Avarice would just be dead in this scenario. Additionally, if you open Salvage, Swap Frog, and any water monster with 1500 or less attack, you can go special summon Swap Frog by pitching the water monster, sending Substitute, salvage them both back, and normal summon Substitute and do the sub combo from there. So this deck is way more consistent because of Salvage being a starter card with Swap Frog and any water for your sub combo. And if you can Substitute combo turn 1, you win almost every single time. Because you can just sculpt your field to whatever your hand is, depending on the match you're playing against. A lot of the time, I just do a regular sub lock turn 1, and then I get advantage over a few turns with Substitute, and eventually I have enough cards to where they can't push through. Salvage is also very good in the late game, because if you have a Monarch, like Caius or Risa, you can add back Swap and any water, special by pitching, and then bounce back this, and then you can Caius them again. You can also reuse some of your frog effects, like Unifrog or Flip-Flop Frog. You can use Salvage to get back the Unifrog and Swap Frog to your hand. Special summon the Swap Frog by discarding any random water, bouncing it back, an additional normal summon for the Unifrog. With a Treeborn from your standby phase, you can then attack directly, destroy their Pulling the Rug, and then tribute away the Treeborn Frog for a Caius. Since I'm playing so many Monarchs and such a heavy focus on Substitute, I decided to main deck 2 copies of Soul Exchange. I believe this card is much better than an enemy controller because this card is good when you don't have Treeborn, and it's good even when you have Treeborn because then the Substitute can get you an additional monster, so you can do a dupe, and sub-lock, which plays better around Brain Control or Caius, and also get rid of their monster. Skipping the battle phase in this deck is not too much of an issue. You can bounce their monsters with Flip-Flop Frog, or just Monarch them away. 1 copy of 1-for-1, the best spell card in this deck, 1 Brain Control, and 1 Heavy Storm. I'm not main decking MST. I don't think this card is good enough to main deck in a deck like this. You have Unifrog to deal with Black Whirlwind, which is searchable by the way. So you don't need to play an unsearchable one-off, which is only good when they have a particular trap that you want to hit, or they have Black Whirlwind. I side this card in because games 2 and game 3, they have cards like Pulling the Rug or Mask of Restrict, which you need to remove. For the trap cards, I play 2 copies of Legacy of Yadagarasu, not because the effect of Legacy is particularly great, drawing a card in trap form, but because of the mind game it creates. So let's say you go first. In game 1, your opponent does not know what you're playing, and you go Swap Frog, send a Treeborn, bounce back Swap Frog, set a Legacy and pass. What does your opponent really do here? Well, they expect that this card is a discard trap or any other trap because you're not going to dust shoot them in the draw phase, so they expect it's one of these 3. A good player here will just pass turn because they know that you cannot bring back Treeborn because it's assumably dead, seeing as these cards cannot be activated. And this way they also play on Monarchs, and perhaps they can draw into cards that can better deal with your Swap Frog on the next turn. Or they do commit, and it's still fine because they still need to keep these cards in mind, so they can't go all in. Perhaps they just do something small. Let's say they summon a Stratos, and they know that, okay, he does not want to do any of these cards on my Stratos because it's just a +1 it replaces itself. He would rather save the Regeki Break for my back row or TT Mirror Force for my larger push, so they just do something small. Well, then you can use Legacy in the standby phase, bring back the Treeborn, and sack for a Monarch. Similarly, if they just pass turn directly to you and not do anything at all, you can stand by face Legacy, bring back the Treeborn, and summon Testalos or Substitute. Now they feel pretty silly because they're probably sitting there with a trap card in their hand. They did instead because they assumed your back row was a Regeki Break or a Wing Blast. Particularly if the Testalos hit away their starter, they didn't want to commit because they didn't want it to get trapped. Now, this does not work as well in games 2 and game 3, so usually I take both of these out. But just them seeing it game 1 forces them to respect it the entire game, or they play into these because they expect it's a legacy, or better yet, they expect that my legacy is a real trap, so they won't commit at all, forcing the game to go on longer, when I'm favored with all of my bombs in my deck. When the cat's out of the bag for games 2 and game 3, this card does get worse, but it helps to make sure that you win game 1. If you can win game 1 in frogs, you're almost sure to win the match, because then you get to play game 2 and game 3, and just need to win one of them. And the chance that they win both of those games against the frog deck is quite slim, because the frog deck is just so powerful. But it does lose to some floodgates post side, so them seeing the floodgate game 2 and game 3 is not as likely. For the real traps, I'm playing 3 copies of Regeki Break. I think this card is better than Wing Blast in this deck, because you need to hedge for the best. I've said this before, and Blackwing is the best deck, let's not beat around the bush. And Regeki Break is the best trap against the Blackwing deck. You would rather use Regeki Break as opposed to a Wing Blast to deal with a floodgate like Mask Restrict or to deal with Black Whirlwind. Karma Cut is better against the monster, but Karma Cut does not hit back row, so it was either between this or Wing Blast for the main deck, and I think this card is just the better one. Torrential and Mirror Force, very powerful trap cards in Edison format, so of course I'm going to utilize these in my frog deck. If my opponent does not commit, I'm okay with not bringing back the Treeborn Frog. And then the best trap card in the game, Dust Shoot. For the extra deck, 1 Armory Arm, 1 Junk Warrior, 1 Android, 1 Cataster, 1 Brio, 1 Urquiza, 1 Goyo, 1 Herbellum, 1 Black Rose, 1 Dark End, 1 Flock Ruler, 1 Colossal, 1 Stardust, 1 Mistworm, and 1 Chimera Tech. There's not much to say about this extra deck. I'm playing the 1 Chimera Tech in case they leave a side random machine on the field. They probably won't, but there's not like anything else really comes up. You could consider playing a Junk Archer because you can summon it with Junk Synchron, but I believe if you have Junk, you might as well just make the Brio or Goyo instead, and I would rather have this in case they randomly leave a side on the field. For the side deck, I have 2 copies of DD Crow. I wanted to play a third of this because it's really good to have Handtraps in the frog deck, seeing as it doesn't conflict with Treeborn Frog. But there just wasn't space, and I don't really want to see 2 of this card against the decks where I sided in. Usually want to hold this for their push, so they can't kill you. Similar to Battle Fader, actually. 1 copy of Death Frog. So if I were to main this card, I would also main Fishborg Blaster, seeing as if you have the Fishborg in the graveyard, you can at any point summon this and make a 6-star. But I had to make a concession for the faster decks, so I had to main deck the Battle Faders, and then the Death Frog was just cut to the side deck. But I wanted to have the option of having Death Frog post side. 1 copy of Dark Dust Spirit. So against Amaryllis, the Frog Mirror, or any deck that puts up a really large field that you can't really deal with, you want Dark Dust to just clear it all away. Even if people are on Legacy, they usually side this out against Frogs because they want a card that's faster. 2 copies of Vanity's Fiend. So Vanity's is similar to Stalos, where if my opponent does not commit, Vanity's is really good to shut off their follow-up. So I side this card in against the faster decks, where I take out Testalos, seeing as it doesn't do enough, and I would rather have Vanity's Fiend to lock out their next turn. The 3rd copy of Soul Exchange for when I go second against pretty much every deck. The MST, as I mentioned, against decks that side in Floodgate, or against Blackwing where you want to hit their Black Whirlwind. It's also good against Amaryllis because you can take away DDR, Mark of the Rose, as well as Miracle Fertilizer. 1 Lightning Vortex to deal with large established fields. This is mainly against decks like Amaryllis, similar to Dark Dust Spirit, where they just summon very large fields that you can't really grind through. And they're really fast decks, so you can't rely on just monarching away their field one at a time. You would rather clear it all away in one swoop. 1 Chalice and 1 Karma Cut. These kind of go in together, particularly Karma Cut against the mirrors. You can hit their frogs, but also remove things like Vanity's Fiend. And the Chalice is pretty similar here, where you can Chalice the Substitute to shut off its effects, or you can Chalice Vanity's Fiend or Fossil Dyna against the decks that side in those. It also helps to have cards that you can set that are defensive, that you can just activate, even if they don't do anything, to bring back your Treeborn. 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole. This may seem very weird in the frog deck. Almost no one plays Bottomless in this deck, because if you draw this against an established field, you can't set it and then hope they summon it. So this card may seem very weird to play in this deck, because this is not a card like Dimensional Prison where you can draw into an established field and then remove their monster. You have to set this preemptively. But I noticed the issue with Deep Prison was that it wasn't impactful enough. So Bottomless is mainly for Amaryllis and Blackwing, because those are the decks where I really want to stop their summons. and they summon frequently, so the bottomless is not often dead. Usually Blackwings can't really do much if you have a bottomless face down, so even if you cannot bring back Treeborn, if you have a Monarch on the field or you're doing sub combo every single turn, losing the +1 off of Treeborn is usually fine if they are not playing at all. And you can also bottomless Amaryllis and Titanial to get rid of it. And then 2 copies of Dust Tornado. Again, decks like Blackwing will side out Legacy against you to put in real traps because they're not trying to do the Legacy bluff against you and they need to speed up your deck. So Dust Tornado being able to hit the real trap cards makes this card much better games 2 and game 3. Also with more people playing Master Restrict, you really want to hit that.